All right, if you have your Bibles, let's turn to... I am trying to assess the light here. Just a moment. There we go. I don't suppose anybody want to open their shades all the way up, would you? Probably not. All right. Jonah chapter 2 this morning in the Old Testament. Jonah chapter 2, as we are moving this morning from the boat to the sea. In our journey with this minor prophet. I'll kind of set this up because I know we have some of you that are visiting this morning and you might be like, I don't even know who Jonah is. Or maybe you do, but you don't know exactly where we are. Well, last week we opened this up by looking at the stormy sea that Jonah was about to be cast into. The backstory to this is he was called by God to go to Nineveh, and he was to preach repentance. Only instead of preaching repentance, instead of going, he fled the opposite direction and went down to a port in Spain. I made the argument that he probably did not actually believe he could escape the Lord's presence, but he decided to flee anyway. And while he was on the boat, the wrath of God, as evidenced in the storm that came up, began to appear, and the sailors that were on the boat with him, he had just hired this crew, and they knew that someone's God is angry. They just don't know who it is. And they cast lots. And in the providence of God, Jonah was revealed to be the guilty party. He probably came under some form of conviction, I would assume, when the captain of the ship, who was not even a follower of the Lord, asked him, what are you doing down below on the ship instead of joining the prayer rally up on top? And that's where a prophet of God would be expected to be, of course. And so he was interrogated when he got up there because he said, well, it's my fault. And so they began to ask him a series of questions. He revealed that he was a prophet of God, and if they wanted to survive, the thing to do would be to throw him overboard. And they finally did. Now, I should mention, I failed to mention this last week, I realized, but they actually did make an aborted effort at taking the boat and taking off to shore and leaving Jonah on board by himself. They didn't really want to throw him overboard. These were not malicious people. But they finally had to. And miraculously, of course, the sea was calm, and the sailors recognized this is from God. This is God. And in my estimation, they became believers. I'm not going to make that argument in detail this morning, but I think that they did. If you go back and look at Jonah chapter 1, I think you'll be convinced as well. In any case, the spiritual lessons that we noted was that Jonah sacrificed himself for others, and Jesus Christ did the very same thing. Jesus, however, was not himself a sinner. He allowed himself to be thrown overboard for sinners, and he went into the waters of God's wrath for us. And that's probably enough of a sermon, and we can go ahead and pray and head out to lunch, but we're not going to. There are parallels between this angry, rebellious prophet and the prophet par excellence, Jesus Christ. He goes beyond being a prophet, of course. He becomes, or I should say he is, a Savior. And we'll talk about that more as we go. But when we left off Jonah, he had been swallowed up by a big fish. Probably everybody in the universe, more or less, with the exception of maybe in some dark village someplace, knows this. And I want to note that this fish was specifically sent by God. Jonah was expelled from the boat. Jonah was expelled from God's sight. And finally, he was expelled from the fish. So I've entitled this sermon this morning in our series, Expulsion. And we're going to look through Jonah chapter 2 this morning to see some lessons. I'm going to read Jonah chapter 2 in its entirety. Would you follow along with me in your copy of God's Word? This is the Word of the living God. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the stomach of the fish, and he said, I called out of my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I cried for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the current engulfed me. All of your breakers and billows passed over me. So I said, I have been expelled from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again toward your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me. weeds were wrapped around my head. I descended to the roots of the mountains. The earth with its bars was around me forever. But you had brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. While I was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who regard vain idols forsake their faithfulness, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land. This is the word of the living God. I think there's probably no greater fear to me. I could name many, but I think my greatest fear would be to be abandoned on the ocean, to end up alone in the ocean at night, all alone. I thought about that a lot. I thought about it a lot over the years. It's sort of a neurotic fear. I can remember as a small child, we would walk, this is back in the days when you didn't think about beach security, and we would walk down to the beach at night, late at night, and I would look out at the ocean. I would find a point way out in the middle of the ocean, and I would say, what would it be like to be bobbing around out there in the dark on the ocean at night? I thought about that many times over the years. Well, for one man, Will Slattery, that actually became a reality. He had chartered a small plane with some friends in Costa Rica. The plane hit turbulent weather, it began spinning out of control, and it forced them to actually parachute out. He was the only survivor. He landed in the ocean, and he quickly extricated himself from the parachute, because if this should ever happen to you, you've got to get the parachute off or you will be entangled in it and drown. All right? He realized, I'm in a third world country, so don't be a spoiled American. There's not going to be a Coast Guard that's going to show up in a third world country. So he floated for hours and hours, becoming exhausted. And in the dead of the night, he said it was the most awful feeling, all alone, not even able to see your hand in front of you, wondering what's lurking below you, taking in salt water against your will, hastening your dehydration, becoming overcome with exhaustion, and he even floated into several colonies of jellyfish, and it was inflicted with unbearable pain, trying to swim his way out. Then he saw what he thought was a large predator coming at him. And even though the water was about 45 degrees in Costa Rica, no less, which I thought was kind of strange, but he pictured a saltwater crocodile swimming out towards him, and he just braced himself in the dead of the night for what he thought was certainly going to be his demise. But, as it turned out, it was, remarkably, a tree, a lifeline, and one that was very much needed in that moment. You know, after Jonah was thrown overboard, God threw him a lifeline as well, a divine lifeline. Chapter 2 is Jonah's doxology of praise to God for the rescue that he experienced, but it wasn't a tree that God sent him, it was a fish. This psalm, and I'm calling it a psalm, it's inserted here, and it may seem like it's out of place. You're reading along, it's narrative, right? It's storytelling. If you're telling your kids a story, then all of a sudden you break into a song of praise, they're going to look at you and think, well, you know, what's going on? What is this in the story? That's what happens here. It may seem out of place, but this is actually not unprecedented at all. If you read the Old Testament carefully, you will see places where you're in a narrative, like when Moses and the Israelites are leaving Egypt and suddenly they stop and compose a song of praise to God. So it's not completely unprecedented at all. And it's not out of place. This song shows us that a change of heart is beginning to take place in Jonah. And, importantly, it sets up an irony, if you would, because Jonah gladly accepts God's mercy while later resenting the fact that it is given to the Ninevites. We'll come to that next week. Let's look at the psalm itself. As I said, I consider this a song or a psalm. It's in that form, but it really begins as a prayer. If you'll notice, he says that he composed it from the stomach of the fish. So he's in the fish, at least during part of the composition. This is given to us as a song. It represents a prayer to God, and that prayer during the time inside the fish. But the important thing is that we understand the prophet who had been disinterested in prayer while on board the ship became very interested in prayer once he realized that he was in dire straits. We can relate to that. If you want your prayer life revived, just go through some terrible situations in life. He'll get there. He's in distress. He's in the depths of Sheol, which in this context, by the way, means he's in the throes of death. He's reflecting on his experience. Now, by the way, let me just make sure you're not confused. He doesn't consider himself in the throes of death while he's in the fish, but prior to being in the fish. That was when he nearly drowned. He cried from the depths. It's the same Hebrew word, by the way, that's used in Psalm 69. I sink in deep mire where there's no standing. I've come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. You ever felt like that as a Christian? I want us to understand this is not some little incident in a swimming pool. I've never had a near-death experience in water, but I was in a public pool as a 7, 8 years old, somewhere around there, and a large child, much larger than me, decided to repeatedly dunk me under the water until my great aunt stepped up with her cane. I don't know if she had a cane at that time, but anyway, I'm just imagining in my mind that she ran across and rescued me from danger. Never forgot that. But I also remember the incident when I was 12 years old when I was in Florida and I got on a raft and fell asleep on the raft and ended up so far out in the ocean I couldn't even see the beach or the hotels. And I frantically began paddling my way back and did not tell my mom and dad where I had been. We live in a world of billboard signs for the mammoth at Holiday World. We like the idea of water and danger and recreation. We charter boats and we go scuba diving, of all things. We have a love affair with water, even though we know it's dangerous. But what could be worse than being out on the sea, floating helplessly, on the sea, not knowing what's below you? It's a terrifying prospect. And for that reason, some of us are more comfortable, the more sensible ones of us, are more comfortable wading in a few inches of salt water. That's enough. Just collect shells and be done with it. Take your pictures and go home. You don't have to get out in it. But Jonah is not merely out on the sea without help. He's out on the sea, tossed around violently. He describes some of that for us with this kind of language. He talks about the current, the breakers, the billows, the deadly waters, the great deep, the weeds, the roots, the bars. And I want you to understand that all of this tells us that the nightmare that Jonah was experiencing was not the fish, but rather the ocean itself. The fish is his deliverance. How many of us grew up hearing about Jonah and the whale? By the way, the Hebrew word's not whale, so forget it, it's not a whale, okay? But that's, whatever. But you heard about this story, and what you heard, what you imagined, if you were like me, was that he's out there, he's like swimming around, he's just having fun. And all of a sudden, a fish swallows him. A whale swallows him. And we think of that as being the nightmare. That's not the nightmare at all. The fish is actually one of the heroes of the story. He swallowed him. He's not the villain. He's the answer to Jonah's distress call. You see that? The fish gets a bad rap. The fish does not get the credit that he deserves. And that is because even us that are adults misunderstand the purpose of the fish. Before the fish came along, Jonah was subjected to the deep. The fish was the rescue. If you're terrified of the deep, take heart. So were most Jewish people in that day. I remember when I was John would probably remember this, being a film buff, but in 1977, the film The Deep, with Nick Nolte and I think Jacqueline Bisset maybe, but this was about a dangerous attempt to recover treasure from a sunken ship. It didn't do that well with critics, but it was a box office smash. It even beat out James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me and Woody Allen's Annie Hall in terms of profits. Two actors from the film, Robert Shaw and Louis Gossett Jr., would later appear in the Jaws franchises. All of that is to say the 70s were a time when we loved movies about water and about the deep. We loved the terror of water, even though we're not really particularly terrified by it when you think about it. Not enough to stay away from it. But in that day, you tried to stay away from the ocean unless you absolutely had to go there. It was viewed as a grave. It was not, you would not as a Jewish person go see a movie about the sea. It was terrifying. It was a grave for for many people. Now, where is God in all this? Well, Jonah recalls in his song that God answered him. Look at verse 2. God heard my voice. But more than that, God controlled the elements that came against him. We know this because the text says, all your breakers and billows passed over me. Who do the breakers and the billows belong to? God. Nothing that is happening to Jonah is by chance, but by prescription. God knows what is needed to humble Jonah and begin a process of maturing him as a man and as a prophet. And what is needed is distress. We often don't understand that. We think the really awful things that happen to us are from Satan, when in fact, all things are from God. We assign them to Satan. We blame them on bad luck. We blame them on ourselves. We blame them on others. The Bible does not see life in that way. The Bible does not see it that way. The Bible does not see the things that happen to us as a product of chance. Giving credit to Satan is not a good idea. Satan can taunt us, he can insinuate, he can whisper doubts about God to us, but he is not given free rein to cause us to have a car accident or to cause us to develop cancer or a sinus infection that won't go away, such as your preacher is dealing with. God is in charge of human life, church. If you're suffering, it may or may not be because of sin, but it is because God has a divine purpose in it. Jonah knew whose hand is behind the veil. He knew it was God's hand, see? Verse 4 gives us a bit of hope, however. So I said, I've been expelled from your sight. Nevertheless, I'll look again to your holy temple. Salvation is by faith alone. Do you know that salvation, think about that. He recognized salvation is by faith alone. That's a doctrinal statement, but it applies right here. Jonah expresses a determination to be saved, and he has the faith to believe that it's going to happen. The passage does not tell us exactly when these things were written or said. We can only speculate. But did Jonah look to the temple while he was in the fish, or was that a later reflection? Well, here's my 2 cents on this. I think Jonah is out of the sea. Jonah is there inside this fish, which is an unimaginable circumstance. And I think he is, in that moment, he's saying, God got me out of the sea. God will get me out of the fish. I will worship Him again. Look at what he says about God, about how God has already rescued him. Verse 5, water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me. Weeds were wrapped around my head. And verse 6 seems to suggest that he descended into what was certainly going to be a watery grave. By the way, you might be interested in knowing that the Mariana Trench off the coast of the Philippines is the deepest part of the ocean. Not much of anything lives there. It's inhospitable. It's 36,000 feet down. I mean, I'm comfortable in 7 feet of water. All right? I don't think Jonah was 36,000 feet beneath the surface, but he might as well have been. Because seaweed is wrapped around his head. He's being engulfed. He descends to the roots of the mountains, which reflects a belief that the foundation of the mountains go down deep to the earth's surface. This is like a prison for him. This is like an aquatic prison with bars. Verse 6. You get the picture quite easily that he must have had a moment where he believed he was going to die. You know, people that have these near-death experiences, usually what they'll say in hindsight was, I thought about my family and friends and how I'd never see them again. I thought, I'm going to die here all alone, and nobody's going to even be able to find me. Jonah had been banished from the presence of God. He had been expelled from God's sight, but God heard his prayer, and God brought his life up from the earth, or from the pit. That's the kind of language you come across when you read the book of Psalms. And I thought it was interesting. When we think of Psalms, we naturally think of King David, who wrote most of them. And here's Jonah, and it's almost as if Jonah saying, a bitter, angry prophet can write a psalm too, David. And it's a quite impressive one. To compose a song of deep emotion is easier if you've been through some serious trials. No offense to teenagers, but I'm not that impressed when I hear Taylor Swift sing about troubles in life. You have to go through some things. I'm more impressed with Roy Orbison. I remember the day Roy Orbison died. I was on my way to school. I was in college. And I remember it being announced on the radio. And I had just bought his his comeback album, Mystery Girl, and had been playing it non-stop, and they announced that he had died suddenly of a heart attack. He was, for years people thought he was blind because of the dark shades that he wore constantly. That was because he was an introvert, and he realized that when he was on stage wearing dark shades made him feel sort of guarded. He said at one point, "I'm one of the loneliest people that you'll ever meet." In 1966, his wife had died in a motorcycle accident. That's bad enough. A few years later, 2 out of 3 of his girls died in a house fire. You think of Roy Orbison, think of Pretty Woman, walking by. If you listen to the anthology of his music, you hear sorrow and sadness and grief and melancholy over and over again. He brought those experiences into his music. Jonah is bringing his distress, his sense of hopelessness into the frame of his composition, but it's not entirely hopeless. While I was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. My prayer came to you into your holy temple. He's revived. He is a man of prayer once again. And the temple is likely not literal here, I don't think. I think it's just saying he's going to go again into the presence of God. Look at verses 8 to 9. Jonah says something we might not expect him to say. He denounces those who regard vain idols and adds that he will sacrifice to God with a voice of thanksgiving and will pay that which he has vowed to pay, which I would take to mean he's going to now do the mission that God has sent him to do. And then these remarkable words, salvation is from the Lord. By the way, that's an axiomatic truth. What I mean by that is when we say salvation is from the Lord, it's an obvious truth. It's an indisputable truth. Salvation comes from the hand of God. It is not from human effort. This is all over the New Testament, but it's not just the New Testament. I heard Albert Mohler say yesterday, instead of saying all the time, I believe in New Testament Christianity, what we ought to say is I believe in biblical Christianity, because the whole Bible is Christianity, really. Even with Jonah, even in his distress, salvation is from the Lord rings loud and clear. The sailors are saved by God's hand. The Ninevites are later going to be saved by God's hand. Jonah is saved by God's hand. And God even throws in a fish as a means of physical salvation. Salvation is of the Lord. It's not of ourselves. We're hopeless. We're helpless. We're the guilty party. We don't deserve salvation. Jonah did not deserve to be rescued. In verse 10, the fish vomits him up. That must have been some relief for this fish, because I don't think he was looking for a meal. I think this was not, a bitter prophet was not on the menu. Jonah's salvation is now complete. He ran from God, but he had gotten caught and he had gotten sentenced to a watery grave, and then he gets clemency in the end. Hopeless, helpless, desperately in need of a lifeline. If you don't see yourself that way as a sinner, you will never really come to faith in Christ. Oh, you might try to clean up morally. You might say, I'm going to try to be a good Christian. I'm going to try to be a better person. I'm going to try to be a better neighbor. I'm going to try to be more moral. I'm going to try to outshine everybody in my family with my exemplary conduct. But that is not salvation. Jonah's plight might characterize any one of us who's not yet come to faith in the Lord. He's entangled in sin, descending rapidly, headed for Sheol, headed for the place of the dead, headed for an eternity all alone, forsaken, and left without hope until God steps in and saves. The fish is Jonah's salvation, not spiritually, of course, but it saved him from a certain death. It also saved him, by the way, from an untimely death, because he would not have gone on that mission trip at all. And, follow me, it's also a note of irony for this passage, because the name Nineveh means a house of fish. You know that if you watch the VeggieTales. Great place to get theology. It's interesting, the founder of VeggieTales said years later, we really didn't do very well with that. We didn't get the gospel out there. But anyway, that's a story for no time. But it refers to Assyria's pagan goddess. God is taking the idea of a fish god, an idol, and he is flipping it to show I'm the one true God and the fish belong to me. Maybe you see bumper stickers like, "My goddess defeated your God." Oh, really? Well, let me tell you something. God's Word is still with us. God's church is still intact and growing in many parts of the world. God is still saving sinners daily. Lives are being changed in churches, homes, communities, prisons, and jails. Meanwhile, your goddess is buried in the ancient past as a footnote in history. Your goddess is a joke. But God of the land and the sea, the God who proved once again His sovereignty, just as He did with Nebuchadnezzar, if you were here a couple of weeks ago. And here's what He does. He takes what's in the sea and He makes it work for His purposes. You see that? The fish did not approach God and say, "Lord, I know you need a fish. I'm Charlie the tuna. I'm here to help." God appointed that fish. God made that fish work for the salvation of Jonah. The fish wasn't given a choice. The fish is just a bystander in all of this. Well, we don't know what He was doing. Was He just whipped up, or was He swimming along and God, we don't know. But God didn't say, "Fish, if you'll exercise your free will and serve me." No. Free will ultimately belongs to God. God just took the fish and made the fish serve His purpose. Jonah rebelled. God tracked him down. God made him to submit. God is in control of the entire story. Now it's true, and let me say this, God can use a hardened, rebellious individual like the Pharaoh. We looked at this earlier in the summer. He can use anyone for His purposes. Sometimes in the Bible there are people who act as heroes, and they're not people of faith at all. But when it comes to salvation, God does a heart change to bring about His purposes, and all that is to say, He changes Jonah's heart. Now, He changes Jonah's heart a little later than we would expect. And in fact, even when we get to the end of the story, Jonah's still in that process. But God isn't really interested in morally reforming people. He wants to turn people into worshipers. You get that? Why did Jonah need to go to Nineveh? Because there was no worship of the Lord in Nineveh. See? As John Piper says, missions exist because worship doesn't. We send missionaries like Sandy to other parts of the world because we want worship to exist there. We invest in missions because we believe there should be a global worship of the Lord Jesus Christ. We support missions because we believe idols need to be abolished and the worship of Christ needs to replace those idols. That doesn't mean that we do it by violence or enslaving people or demanding they convert. It means we send emissaries. We send ambassadors for Jesus Christ and then depend on God to make things happen. Just as He did with the sailors. Just as He did with the storm. Just as He did with Jonah. We trust all things to God and just wait until you get to Nineveh. Because God is the God of the land and the sea. He expelled Jonah out of the boat. He expelled him out of the sea. He expelled him out of the fish. Because everything that happens because of what we call providence. Providence. You've heard that term many times, but you may not really know what it means. Well, it's a Big East basketball school. Well, it's more than that. It's a legal phrase. Or actually, let me back up. It's a theological phrase that says that God is divinely the author of all things. But there's a legal term that we sometimes use called act of God. You ever said that? It's an act of God. I did that sometimes when I was in college. I'm sorry I couldn't turn in my report or my assignment. It was an act of God that it was lost and so forth. You may not have realized when you're using that phrase that it's a legal phrase, but it protects people from being financially liable for things that are beyond human control. Sometimes the term force majeure is used. It means occurrences beyond the reasonable control of a party. Here's how it works. You buy tickets to go see your favorite rock band at the state fair. And a violent thunderstorm hits with flooding rains and 90-mile-per-hour winds. The concert is canceled and you can't get a refund because of force majeure. It was circumstances beyond the reasonable control of the party. It's an act of God. In 1915, Charles Hatfield was hired by the city of San Diego to fill the reservoirs. He was going to be paid $10,000. But as it turned out, astronomically severe rains hit. The reservoir burst $3.5 million in damage happened. Telephone and telegraph lines were knocked out, and they didn't need Charlie's help any longer. And he was not paid. He had not signed a contract. And he was left, as you might say, all wet. It's a true story. It's a remarkable story. It's a story of an act of God. But so is the story of Jonah. It's an act of God. Think about it. Jonah may have been out there bouncing around on the sea, feeling very inconvenienced, and feeling very angry, and feeling very unjustly treated. But what could he do? Who's he going to sue? Is he going to sue God? This is God's doing. And listen, so is everything. So is everything. Everything that happens is God. God is behind the scenes. Everything. I realize some theologians, when it comes to natural disasters, they say, well, God permitted it. God wasn't, they want to try to get God off the hook. But listen, when the Bible talks about these kinds of events, wars, disasters, betrayals, like when Judas betrayed Jesus, drought, famine, leprosy, and the cross of Christ, the Bible does not speak of them as chance or bad luck or karma. The Bible says God caused these things to happen. He's the God of the land and the sea. And the universe does not function on its own. The eclipse tomorrow is God's eclipse. Be sure to wear your glasses. And don't blame it on God, by the way, if you've ignored a million warnings about how to not view the eclipse. For my part, I'm not going to look outside at all. I'm too fearful. But I will look outside, but I'm not going to look up. But we can say, well, when a deer stops to drink from a brook, does it drink because of God? When a leaf falls from the tree, does it fall from the tree because of God? In other words, does God micromanage those things? Well, that's a discussion for another day. But the point is that God is active in the lives of His people. People that don't even know Him. All kinds of people. People in Cyprus. People in Iraq, people in modern-day Assyria. God is still active in places. There's no longer a city called Nineveh, but God's active there. God's not absent from anywhere in the world. Now, He may not be worshipped everywhere, but He still has rule and reign there, whether it's acknowledged or not. I'm saying all this to make sure we don't walk away from this study confused about who's in charge in the story and who's in control. Jonah is a story of salvation, but Jonah is also a story of sovereignty. Jonah was saved from death because God expelled him from the fish. His whole journey from beginning to end was mapped out by God. That's why fleeing to Spain didn't cause God to panic. God let the prophet run, but who has the leash? God has the leash. God has the leash. When you take your dog out to walk, and maybe your dog is like Kitten Dave. I know Kitten Dave are not here this morning, but they have a dog that wants to fight. Wants to fight against them. But when you take that dog out, even though that dog may fight your authority, you are the one with the leash. The prophet is God's prophet, and your life and mine belongs to God. Do you know that when Jesus prayed in John 17, He said, Father, all things are yours, and yours are mine. And He was referring contextually to the disciples. But do you know that that's true of everyone that belongs to Jesus Christ? You are His. If you belong to Jesus, it's because He bought you with His blood. You are His. You belong to the Father. You belong to the Son. You're not autonomous. You're not a free agent. You don't just live your life however you want. You're a bondservant of Christ. You might say, well, I don't like that very much. Maybe I shouldn't have signed up for that. Well, whose kingdom would you like to belong to? Would you rather belong to Satan's? Now, Satan does not have an eternal kingdom. Don't picture hell as the place down there where Satan's got the pitchfork and he's out there torturing people. Satan suffers in hell. You understand that? Hell is a place for Satan to suffer along with everybody else that rejects Christ. But in this temporal world, whose kingdom would you want to belong to? The benevolent kingship of Jesus Christ or the malicious kingship of Satan? And I use that term kingship with a small k, please understand, because he is on a leash as well. It's not a reason to grumble if you belong to King Jesus. It's a reason to rejoice. Belonging to Jesus is a privilege. God did not have to save you. He could have left you. He could have left me entangled. God could have looked at us, drowning as it were in our sin and unbelief, and left us in that situation. If you're a follower of Christ this morning, it's because He saw you sinking. Jonah, while down in the depths, kicking and screaming for his life, and then finding the respite of the fish, was not in an ideal situation, of course. This is not a weekend at the Marriott. But at least in the fish, he knew he was safe, and he knew God was in control. He knew things were going to work out for his ultimate good. Even when you are in the ocean of tribulation and trial, and maybe it's not because God is rebuking you or disciplining you, but because He has a purpose, even then you can rejoice because He's not unaware of what's going on. He knows you're out there. He knows you're struggling. In due time, He'll rescue. In fact, He's already rescued you, even if you can't see it. You say, why do you say that? Well, because you belong to Jesus, and Jesus guards His sheep. It doesn't mean you won't suffer physically. It doesn't mean that you're immune to the breakers of the world, but it does mean He guards your soul. He guards your eternity. He's not going to let He's not going to let Satan snatch you out of His hand. So even when it feels like you're drowning, you are not perishing. You are not perishing. This is a major turning point for Jonah. He's going to begin to trust God. He's going to take steps to go on his journey. He is going to have a really terrible conversation with God at the end of the book. We'll get to that. But the time out that takes place here in the fish is needed. We might not have this chapter before us if it were not for that time out. And be thankful for the fish. Be grateful to the fish for his exemplary participation in the story. The fish prepared Jonah for the next act. We're going to see that next time. Will Slattery was eventually rescued, by the way. He spent many hours, amazingly, hanging onto that tree that he thought was a saltwater crocodile. The tree saved his life. He woke up the next morning after hours in the cold sea, because even though he was off the coast of Costa Rica, it was cold. He woke up, he saw land. Well, that's a good thing. But he realized the tree was keeping him from the land, because as he was hanging onto the tree was pulling him back out, pulling him further out. And he said, I realized I had to let go of the only lifeline that I had. And then he tried to go on his own strength. It still didn't work. He floated on his back. He resigned himself. I'm just going to die. Well, the weather had cleared, and a search and rescue party was out, and he began to see planes flying overhead. But he said later, I saw many planes that were not even looking for me. And I'm trying to weigh that up. Couldn't even hardly do that. He began to hallucinate because of dehydration. And then he saw what he thought was a boat approaching him. A small boat, a small little fishing boat. And he thought, I'm hallucinating. There's no boat. But then he realized it was real. And he was rescued. And he would live to tell his amazing story. And it is an amazing story. But what disappointed me about the story is that in his explanation for how he survived, he had no place for God and the explanation. He was humble about the event, to be fair. But he said, my rescue was ultimately my determination to survive and chance. The chance tree. The chance boat. That was not Jonah's explanation. Jonah knew the rescue boat was not chance, it was God. I hope you know, church, when you take time, and I'm speaking to those of you that are Christians. If you're not a Christian, you can't quite relate to this, but listen nevertheless. If you're a Christian, when you reflect on your own salvation, and you think about how you were tangled in sin, and you were swallowed up in unbelief, I hope you know you would not be expelled from that ordeal were it not for the Father's decree and for the Son's sacrifice. It wouldn't have happened. Jesus Christ was expelled from the presence of God so you would not be. As I said last time, He was thrown overboard so that we would not be thrown eternally overboard. And you say, yeah, but He's back with the Father. Sure, yes, in glory today. But imagine, if you would, His ordeal. In the sea of God's wrath, swallowed up by the grave for sins He did not commit. Matthew 12:40, Jesus even said this, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Jesus saw this event in the past. And by the way, he treated it as absolutely historically true. He did not say that was just an allegory. No, he treats it as true, and then he applies it to his own experience coming up. What he's going to face, he's going to be in the deep for 3 days. But just like Jonah, God would expel him from that grave. He would make landfall. And though a day will come, unless he returns first, of course, in which you and I will be laid down in the earth, in Sheol, it will not be in defeat, not if you know Jesus. Do you know Jesus? Let me say this to those of you that don't. If you don't know Jesus, and I say this with all the grace and mercy possible, but understand you will someday sink into the deeps of God's wrath, and you will never rise, and no lifeboat is going to come. But if you do know Jesus, you'll be expelled from the grave. You will rise with him out of the deep, and you'll make landfall on his celestial shore. Father, we thank you for Jesus. He is our lifeboat. There is no salvation apart from him. Salvation belongs to our God. Praise be to his name. Father, I pray for anyone that is trying right now to be their own lifeboat. They think that by some kind of moral track record or exemplary conduct or chance that they'll get to some kind of glorious utopia on their own. Lord, let them know it does not exist and it will not happen. Instead, they will face the eternal wrath of God. They need to turn to Jesus. They need to turn to Jesus. Father, I pray that they would have a deep sense that they are entangled in sin and how much they need him. Father, for those of us that know Christ, it's easy for us to begin to slip, as it were, and lose our sense of how much we were saved from. Guard us against that. When that happens, pull us back to you. Pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen. You respond as Jason leads us to worship the Lord. And a little later, we'll come to the Lord's table. And I want you to think, I'll say this in advance, I want you to think when you come to the Lord's table, if you're a follower of Christ, you are welcome to come. If you're not a follower of Christ, if you don't know Jesus savingly, please refrain out of respect for this ordinance. It's a holy ordinance. But if you know Jesus, he is your Savior, I invite you to come, and I want you to think this morning of how Christ is your lifeboat. But would you respond? If you need prayer, grab somebody and come and pray. Please sing.